June 12th, Washington, D.C. A congressional hearing room that was supposed to be routine until it wasn't. On National Women's Veterans Day, in front of cameras, under oath, Sarah Jacobs forced a moment that exposed something far bigger than policy. 3 service members, all rated top 5% by commanding officers with 18 to 22 years of experience. One had flown over 50 combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Every evaluation said the same thing: exceeds standards. And sitting across from her, Pete Hegseth had already said twice that the military should retain its best. Then came the line that changed everything. These are trans women, and you are kicking them out. So here's the question no one in that room could dodge. If performance is proven, documented, undeniable, why are they being removed at all? This is not a normal hearing. This is a stress test of a system that claims to run on merit, but suddenly hesitates when merit has a face it doesn't like. Jacobs doesn't start with outrage. She starts with his words, his own record, his own confirmation testimony, pulled back into the present like evidence re-entering a courtroom. She quotes him precisely. Women in the military have made extraordinary contributions, some of the best soldiers he ever served with. Then she asks the simplest question possible, the kind that sounds harmless until you realize it locks everything in place. Do you still stand by that statement? He says yes. That yes is not just agreement. It's a commitment entered into the record twice, in 2 separate settings, under 2 different moments of scrutiny. And Jacobs knows exactly what she's doing because once that answer is secured, everything that follows is no longer an argument. It's a comparison. She doesn't generalize. She doesn't debate ideology. She builds 3 human profiles, one after another, each one anchored in documents written by commanding officers whose job is to measure readiness, performance, and reliability. The first, a major responsible for advanced warfighting training, rated most qualified, described as living the Army values daily, placed in the top 5% by a commander with 18 years of experience evaluating soldiers. Not top quarter, not above average, top 5%. That number matters because it eliminates ambiguity. Either that commander knows how to assess excellence, or the entire evaluation system collapses. The second, an aviator with over 50 combat missions, deployed repeatedly into hostile environments, receiving the strongest possible recommendation for promotion. That is not a political opinion. That is a documented record of survival, execution, and trust under pressure. You don't get 50 missions by accident, and you don't get recommended for promotion at that level unless someone above you is willing to stake their credibility on your performance. The third, an instructor rated as far exceeding standards, placed again in the top 5%, this time by a senior evaluator with 22 years of service. Another long-term comparison pool, another independent judgment, another confirmation that excellence in this system is supposed to be measurable, repeatable, and recognized across different units and different leaders. And this is where the frame tightens, because Jacobs is not asking about policy yet. She's asking about retention. Should the military keep people like this? High performers, proven under pressure, documented by their own chain of command as among the best they've ever seen. He answers predictably, yes, they should be commended, recognized, retained. Of course they should. That's the logic of merit. That's the logic the institution claims to operate on. But here's the problem. If you say merit matters, then you are bound by the outcomes of the system that measures it. You don't get to celebrate the evaluation process when it confirms your beliefs and discard it when it challenges them. And Jacobs knows this. She is not arguing yet. She is assembling, step by step, statement by statement, record by record, until the gap between what is said and what is done becomes too wide to ignore. And this is the moment where the entire structure snaps into focus. Because Sarah Jacobs doesn't raise her voice, doesn't change her tone, doesn't signal a shift. She simply reveals the missing variable that turns consistency into contradiction. These are trans women. No buildup, no theatrics, just a fact placed directly into the record. And suddenly, everything that came before, the top 5%, the combat missions, the strongest recommendations, collides with a policy that moves in the opposite direction. Because if those 3 individuals meet every standard the military claims to value, then removing them is no longer a performance decision. It becomes something else entirely. Pete Hegseth doesn't answer with data. He interrupts, and what he says matters, not because it resolves the contradiction, but because it reveals where his argument actually lives. These are men who think they're women. That statement doesn't engage with the evaluation reports Jacobs just read. It doesn't address readiness metrics. It doesn't challenge the commanding officer's assessments. It shifts the frame from performance to identity. And that shift is everything. Because once identity becomes the deciding factor, the entire merit-based framework he just affirmed starts to unravel. Jacobs pushes back immediately, correcting the record. These are women. Not as rhetoric, but as a direct rejection of the premise he's trying to introduce. The exchange tightens, no space left for abstraction. So Hegseth pivots again, this time to readiness. He claims that what he calls a belief system tied to gender identity is linked to mental health issues, and that those issues are detrimental to military effectiveness. It sounds like an argument about performance, but it isn't supported by the only performance metrics that matter in that room, the evaluation reports written by commanding officers, and Jacobs knows exactly where to press. She goes straight back to the documents, the fit reps, the officer evaluations, all written within the last 3 months, all saying the same thing: exceeds standards. She doesn't reinterpret them, she doesn't summarize, she uses them as they are. Official records generated by the military's own chain of command. And then she asks the question that collapses the entire defense into a binary choice. Do you trust your commanding officers to evaluate readiness or not? Because if the answer is yes, then their evaluations must stand. And those evaluations say these individuals are not detrimental, they are exceptional. But if the answer is no, if those commanding officers cannot be trusted to assess the people under them, then the entire concept of merit inside the military becomes unstable. Promotions, assignments, leadership pipelines, all of it depends on those same evaluations. You can't selectively believe them. This is where the logic tightens into something unavoidable. You cannot claim that merit determines value and then ignore the system that measures merit when it produces outcomes you don't like. You cannot say readiness matters and then dismiss the only documented evidence of readiness because it conflicts with your personal framework of identity. That's not a policy disagreement. That's a structural inconsistency. And here's the deeper problem. Once that inconsistency is exposed, it doesn't stay contained to this one issue. It spreads. Because if one category of service members can have their documented performance overridden by a separate criterion, then merit is no longer the governing principle. It's a conditional one, applied when convenient, suspended when not. Jacobs doesn't need to say that out loud. The record says it for her. And the silence that follows isn't dramatic. It's functional. There is no clean way to reconcile those two positions without abandoning one of them. And just when it looks like the argument might stay contained within the question of who gets to serve, Sarah Jacobs pivots, and the scope of the problem expands instantly. Because what she does next is not a transition. It's a replication of method, same structure, same precision, different subject, and somehow even more destabilizing. She brings in testimony from the day before, not from a pundit, not from an outside critic, from the highest-ranking military advisor in the country, Charles Q. Brown, Jr. Under oath before the Senate, he was asked a direct question: is the United States under a foreign invasion? His answer was equally direct: no, no ambiguity, no qualifiers, no rhetorical hedging. A clear assessment from the person whose job is to evaluate threats at the highest level. And yet, at that exact moment in time, 2,000 National Guard troops had been federalized and deployed to Los Angeles. 700 Marines active duty on the ground, not for training, not for overseas operations, for domestic deployment. And the justification given publicly by the President of the United States was just as explicit: an invasion. That word wasn't implied. It was used, repeatedly, framed as the reason military force was necessary. So now, the contradiction is no longer theoretical, it's operational. Because you have two statements that cannot both be true at the same time. The commander-in-chief invoking an invasion to justify military deployment, and his own top military advisor stating under oath that no such invasion exists. That's not a disagreement over strategy. That's a break in alignment between policy and reality. Jacobs doesn't editorialize. She doesn't dramatize. She simply places those two facts next to each other and asks the question that turns the gap into a matter of record. Have you informed the president that based on your assessment, there is no invasion? The answer from Brown is careful, measured. He stands by his testimony. He notes that definitions can be shaped by policy context, and then he draws a line. His private advice to the president remains private. On the surface, that sounds like standard protocol, but underneath it, the gap remains completely intact. Nothing has been reconciled. Nothing has been clarified. And Jacobs does something subtle but critical. She names the gap out loud. The highest-ranking military official does not see an invasion. The president claims there is one and deploys troops based on that claim. She puts both statements in the same frame, in the same hearing, in front of the same officials, and then she runs out of time. The chairman cuts her off. The question hangs, unanswered. But here's the part that matters. The cutoff doesn't erase the contradiction. It preserves it. Because hearings are governed by time, but oversight is governed by record. And once those two statements exist side by side in the official record, they don't disappear when the clock runs out. They sit there, waiting for reconciliation that never arrives. And now the pattern is undeniable. In the first case, performance data conflicts with identity-based policy. In the second, military assessment conflicts with political justification. Two different issues, same structural flaw. Evidence produced by the system itself, then contradicted by the decisions made on top of it. This is no longer about a single policy. It's about whether the system is still anchored to its own evidence, or whether the evidence has become optional. And this is where everything converges, not in policy language, not in procedural debate, but in consequence. Because behind every top 5% rating is not a statistic. It's a person who trained, deployed, performed, and was measured by a system that promised one thing: if you meet the standard, you belong. And in this hearing, that promise is quietly being rewritten in real time. 3 service members, documented as among the best their commanders have seen in nearly 2 decades, are no longer being evaluated by what they do, but by who they are. And that shift matters because it changes the contract between the institution and the individual. It tells every soldier, every aviator, every instructor watching that excellence is not enough if it collides with a line someone else has drawn. That merit is not a guarantee. It's a condition. And outside that room, the consequences widen. Because when a government deploys 2,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines based on a claim its own top military advisor does not support, the issue is no longer internal consistency. It's public trust. If the justification for force can diverge from the assessment of those tasked with evaluating threats, then what exactly anchors that decision? What is the standard? What is the threshold? And who decides when evidence matters and when it doesn't? This is where the moral contrast becomes impossible to ignore. On one side, individuals who have proven themselves repeatedly under pressure, measured by commanders whose job is to identify readiness and reward performance. On the other, a framework that overrides those measurements without disproving them, not correcting them, not updating them, simply bypassing them. That is not refinement. That is replacement. And once that replacement happens, it doesn't stay isolated, because if merit can be set aside in one case, it can be set aside in others. If documented readiness can be dismissed without evidence, then readiness itself becomes subjective. And when readiness becomes subjective, the system loses its anchor. It stops being a structure built on evaluation and starts becoming one shaped by preference. So the real question is no longer about these 3 service members. It's about the integrity of the system that evaluated them. Because you cannot build a framework that claims to reward excellence and then ignore excellence when it becomes inconvenient. You cannot say you trust your commanders and then disregard their judgment when it contradicts your narrative. And you cannot justify the use of force with a claim your own military leadership does not affirm and expect that contradiction to go unnoticed. This is not a partisan dispute. It is a credibility test, a test of whether the words merit, readiness, and truth still carry consistent meaning inside the institutions that depend on them. Because if those words can shift depending on the context, then they stop being standards. They become tools. So here's the question that remains, unresolved and sitting in the record. If evidence can be documented, verified, and still ignored, what exactly is left to trust? And if the system asks for performance but rewards something else, what message does that send to the people still willing to serve? If you think this matters, not just for policy, but for the integrity of the system itself, then don't just watch and move on. Break it down, question it, share it. And if you want more moments like this, where the record speaks louder than the rhetoric, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe.